Good morning, everybody. I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Shad and River Herring Management Board. My name is Justin Davis. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from the state of Connecticut, and starting with today's meeting, I'll be taking over as chair of this board. Quickly, I just want to acknowledge the great leadership of our outgoing board chair, Mike Armstrong from the state of Massachusetts. Thanks, Mike, for all your work in leading this board over the last couple of years, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to take over. So the first item on our agenda today is approval of the agenda. I'll ask if there's any suggested modifications or additions to today's agenda.
No hands, Justin.
Okay, great. So we'll consider the agenda approved by consent. And moving on, the proceedings from the February 2021 meeting of this board were provided in the meeting materials. Are there any suggested corrections or additions to those proceedings from the February meeting?
No hands, Mr. Chair.
Okay, great. We'll consider the proceedings from the February meeting approved by consent. The next item on our agenda is public comment. Caitlin or Tony, did we have anybody sign up to provide public comment?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Des has his hand up, though, Mr. Chair.
Okay, sure. Des, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, thanks. I made some comments at the last meeting of this board in February about evidence that striped bass predation has a negative impact on shad abundance in the Delaware River in particular. And for this meeting, I arranged with ASMC staff to distribute a document that portrays this evidence. And I trust, board members have received this. If you get a chance to look at it, I don't know if you have it available now, but what you'll see is that the first thing is the index of abundance of American shad in the Delaware River from about 1984 to 2014. That's called, that's at the Lewis Hall saying, that's the Lewis family in New Jersey, freshwater area above the head of tide. It's a very long-term index. It goes way back before 84. The next thing, the next chart you'll see is a plot of the catch per trip of striped bass in the waters of the state of Delaware between 1984 and 2014. This is pretty much very similar to the time series of abundance portrayed by the statistical catch at age model in the striped bass stock assessment, showing a low period in the 80s and an increase and a peak in about the 2000s and then some decline. Then you'll see a plot of the two indices together. And as I mentioned last time, you'll have a chance to look at this. When striped bass were low, shad were booming in the 80s in particular. As striped bass increased in the 90s, shad declined. And when you had the sort of peak of striped bass in the 2000s, shad were at their lowest level. And if you were, I don't know if you were involved back then, but in 2005, due to a coast-wide decline of shad, the Shad Management Board shut down an intercept gillnet fishery along the coast with the idea that that might be the cause of this shad decline. That had no impact whatsoever. If you look at the plot of the Delaware Index of Abundance, there was no response. What that implies is that the fishery was having, it implies it had little to no impact on stock abundance. In other words, it was a very minimal impact. These two indices are highly significantly statistically negatively correlated. And what that is taken in fisheries ecology is to mean is that the predator is controlling the prey. That's known as top-down control, when you have a negative correlation between abundance of these two of two species like this. So what the implication of this is, and I'm going to wrap this up, is that as long as we have this very high abundance of striped bass with very large individuals that can consume adult shad, we're not going to get a return of shad or blueback herring to high abundance that they enjoyed in a period like the 80s. And this has also been borne out on the Connecticut River, including by work that you yourself, Mr. Chairman, did as a graduate student there, showing consumption of adult shad by large striped bass in the river. Victor Kreco and Tom Savoy of Connecticut Bureau of Marine Fisheries documented this in several publications. And lastly, Victor Kreco told me he'd had visual evidence when he could see schools of large striped bass herding American shad up against the Holyoke Dam all the way up in Massachusetts and preying on them. So we got the mechanism, predation for this negative correlation, and I wanted to make the board aware of this evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Des. Appreciate that comment, and also appreciate you making those materials available to the board ahead of this meeting. Are there any other members of the public who'd like to make comment today? Do we have any hands, Tony?
I don't, Jeff Kalin has his hand up.
Okay, Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't know we were going to open up comments, but I just wanted to say that I really did appreciate Des's work. I thought it was really interesting because, you know, the shorthand version of blueback and shad declines, you know, recently has been the offshore fishing fleet. So, you know, obviously it's really a little more complex than that. And I do know, I just was talking to Jason Didden at the council the other day, a few years ago when this came up. We did go back and look at the shoreside monitoring data, which several years of 50% of the trips in the midwater trawl fishery. And really, that fleet doesn't catch very much shad. So there is some data out there, Mr. Chairman. I think I brought it up as an AP member, so I just wanted to make that point. Certainly, we want to see these stocks rebuild, and it is complex. So I wanted to thank Des for his work and for the committee to consider, you know, this in a very broad way. So thanks for allowing me to make those comments.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Any other members of the public who'd like to make comment?
I don't see any other hands, Justin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tony. So we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is to get a review of technical committee progress on board tasks. We've got the chair of our technical committee, Brian Nealon, here this morning, who's going to be giving us a presentation on 3 different items, 2 of which will require some board action. And I think the way I'd like to proceed here is to give the presentation on each item and then stop and have a period of time for questions and comments and then potentially taking action on that item. That being said, you know, we've got about 35 minutes on the clock here to get through these 3 items, so I will be looking to move things along to try to keep us on schedule. And with that, Brian, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the board. My name is Brian Nealon. I'm the TC Chair and rep from New Jersey. Today we have a couple of presentations that staff put together for you. First, we will have this presentation on the TC's progress on a few board tasks, and then I'll review some shad habitat plan updates as well. Go next slide. So here's a quick overview of what this presentation will cover. First, at the last board meeting, the board tasked the TC with developing a guidance document for implementing requirements under Amendment 2 and 3. So we'll review the highlights of this document, and then the board will consider it for approval. Second, I'll go over the progress made so far in regards to the task of evaluating and addressing bycatch and mixed stock fisheries in state waters. And finally, we'll go over a letter with recommendations from the TC on addressing fish passage performance, which we know has been a significant impediment to stock recovery. Go next slide. Okay, so first up is a review of the technical guidance document developed by the TC to help states and jurisdictions better implement amendments 2 and 3 to the FMP. Next slide. For some background, back in late 2017, the board tasked the TC to develop proposed improvements to amendments 2 and 3 in regards to these 5 issues here: management and monitoring of rivers with low abundance and harvest, standardization of SFMP requirements, incorporation of stock assessment information into SFMPs, and discussion on the timeline for renewing plans, clarification of de minimis requirements as they pertain to SFMPs, and a review of years of data required for developing an SFMP. Next slide. At the previous board meeting in February, the board approved the TC's recommendations and subsequently tasked the TC with developing a guidance document. This document is to help states and jurisdictions best implement the measures required by amendments 2 and 3. And the draft document was included with your meeting materials for this meeting. Next slide. So just for the record, the TC does not recommend any changes to the FMP to address commercial fisheries. These will still have a SFMP requirement. An FMP should clarify the management of recreational fisheries specifically, and the recreational fisheries should be dependent on the availability of harvest and monitoring information. This chart rubric that staff put together and the board approved for allowing recreational harvest should be used when a state is deciding which type of FMP to develop, either a standard SFMP or an alternative management plan as allowed under the amendments. Which type of plan a state can implement is dependent upon the known or suspected presence of shad or river herring in the system, as well as the quantity and quality of the data available to support a given type of plan. The board approved this chart back in February, and it's used for recreational fisheries. So unless there's any specific questions to keep it moving, I won't go over this the entire chart. All right, not hearing any, we can go to the next slide. So in regards to technical guidance on the standardization of FMP requirements, plans should provide details on management responses to trip triggers, including the type of restrictions that will be considered. There can be a suite of options, and states must notify the board if a threshold is exceeded and implement a management response in the following fishing year. Any restriction that is implemented in response to an exceeded threshold must be in place until the associated target that was tripped is met for 5 consecutive years. And finally, in the case of interjurisdictional water bodies, states should cooperatively develop FMPs and implement identical sustainability targets and management measures on that interjurisdictional water body. You can go next slide. So for issue 3, incorporation of stock assessment information into SFMPs, the TC will continue to review information on required and ongoing monitoring efforts and develop recommendations for improvements to data use in these plans and assessments. Essentially, the TC will continue to review data on a case-by-case basis and make appropriate recommendations on what should be included in a given SFMP based on the data that we have available. Also, plans will continue to be required to be updated and reviewed every 5 years. Next slide. The document makes no changes to the de minimis requirements. To qualify for de minimis status, states must land less than 1% of the coastwide commercial quota, commercial total, to be exempted from subsampling commercial and recreational catch for biological data. This does not exempt states from the requirement to prohibit recreational harvest and possession, with exceptions for systems that have a approved sustainable fishery plan. All right, next slide. So the TC guidance on minimum number of years of data required to develop and establish a primary sustainability metric is 10 years of data for American shad, that's consecutive years of data, and 10 years of data for river herring. In the case of river herring, the TC may accept a time series of 7 to 9 years, with consideration of additional information to justify this shorter time series, such as exploitation rate, stock size, passage efficiency, really just case by case. All right, next slide. So the TC also developed some further guidance beyond the initial board task as it was reviewing the amendments in regards to the use of alternative management plans. Going forward, the document requires that states proposing an AMP should now also include a rationale or justification for why a standard fishery management plan cannot be used. Justification that the proposed management program will be conservationally equivalent to catch and release. Explanation of how the state will determine if or when an AMP is no longer appropriate, including a data source and trigger, such as 3 years of harvest that's observed through a creel survey or something similar. And a description of management response if the trigger is met. And we have an example here. If harvest is documented through a creel survey for 3 consecutive years, catch and release only regulations will be implemented statewide or for specified systems. If a management trigger in an AMP is met, the state must notify the board in the next compliance report and pursue implementation of a management response for the following calendar year. So that's all I have in regards to the TC's guidance document. I could take any questions anyone might have before the board considers the document for approval.
Great, thanks, Brian. I'll turn it back to the board and ask if anybody has questions for Brian on the presentation.
Right now, I just see Cherie Patterson with her hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Cherie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you please go back to slide 7, I believe, if that's possible? And I have a question in regards to B, where you have management restrictions implemented in response to a stock falling below the sustainability target must stay in place until the target or targets have been met for at least 5 consecutive years of sufficient data collection. What was the purpose of going up to 5 consecutive years as opposed to what is in there currently, where it indicates proposals to reopen closed fisheries may be submitted as part of the annual compliance report and may be subject or will be subject to review by the plan development team, TC, and management board? I'm thinking this 5 consecutive years is a little extreme for some instances, and I'd like to know why it went to 5 consecutive years.
Sure. So the TC felt that there's they wanted some hard number. Just basically, there's sometimes we have a lot of gray, and we're looking for a little more black and white in the amendments 2 and 3. 5 consecutive years is considered basically one shad generation, and given the results from the assessment and the general coastwide depleted status, the TC felt that 5 years was conservative at a level of conservation that they felt they were comfortable with.
Okay, follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Thank you. So this regards both shad and river herring, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I don't have a problem with everything else stated within this technical guidance. However, I do with 2B. I think that 5 consecutive years may be fine for shad. It doesn't have to be that high for river herring, as well as there are many reasons behind instituting a management restriction that may not have to do with the stock itself having an issue. An example could be what we've run into in New Hampshire. We had a dam removal occur, and it's taken us 2 to 3 years to figure out how to now account for the fish passing through that former dam site. So we have reduced numbers counted for those reasons, as well as when anybody does a fish passage modification, that could affect passage until the modification is realized or not realized, and more modification needs to occur. It's not saying that the fish, the stock itself is failing. It's the accountability for how various states are counting these targets and thresholds. So I'm a little leery of this one, and I would prefer to have the previous language be put into this particular standardization, where it says that the proposals to reopen closed fisheries may be submitted as part of the annual compliance report and still be subject to that review by all 3 members or portions of the management, being the plan development team, the TC, and the management board, because there are exceptions to this, and I'd hate to see some standardization interrupt those exceptions. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could follow up, this is Caitlin.
Sure, go ahead, Caitlin.
I definitely hear Sherry's concerns, and I just wanted to kind of offer how this document would be utilized. So just to clarify, there wouldn't be necessarily a hard requirement, since this wouldn't be written into the FMP, for there to be at least 5 years where that sustainability target is being met. It would still be subject to TC review, but this is to give the technical committee some more structure with how they're looking at these requests. So I do believe that in the case that Cherise described, where there's another reason besides the population itself that's causing a sustainability target to not be met, the technical committee would still have some ability to take that information into account when they're making a decision or a recommendation to the board about whether to reopen or remove a management restriction. And then ultimately it would still be the board's purview to approve or not approve such a request.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Sure, go ahead, Sherry.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Caitlin, that it allows the TC some guidelines. That being said, you have guidelines here specific to shad, whereas you can have a lower consecutive year data collection for river herring. Why aren't you putting 3 to 5 years, or 3 years for river herring and 5 for consecutive years for shad?
I can allow Brian to answer that, but I don't believe, I guess I was under the impression that the 5 years was applied to both species, not just shad. So Brian, if you have any follow-up to add.
Sure. Yeah. In this case, it was both species, not just shad. Given the state of the river herring and shad stocks, I think the TC wanted to err on the side of caution and apply the longer time series to both species. I think Caitlin made a great point there that if if a jurisdiction submits some sort of a reason as to why their numbers might be off, and it's not just the fishery, we have this consecutive years of sufficient data collection here, and I think that if you could make the case, the TC is going to review it and understand that.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll ask at this point if we maybe hit pause on this particular discussion. And I'm just going to ask if any other board members have questions related to the presentation we were just given on the technical guidance document.
We have one hand, Bill Hyatt.
Okay, Bill. Bill, if you're speaking, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I thought this guidance document provides a nice balance between giving states flexibility and requiring consistent, clear standards. That said, I do have one question, and that pertains to the use of alternative management plans for recreational fisheries. You said that alternative recreational management plans could be used in instances where they have the same conservation value as catch and release for recreational fisheries. And I was just wondering if you could expand upon that with an example to make that a little easier to understand. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Brian, do you want to field that one?
Sure. So I guess we could go to the previous slide. Is that what we're looking at? Just to get an idea of what I'm answering here, to better understand how to apply the AMPs to recreational fisheries.
Brian,
my question had to do specifically with equivalency to catch and release, just sort of an example that would make that a little bit clearer.
Okay, sure. So I think in some of the southern states, I think particularly this might have came up specifically with Georgia, where they have exceptionally low presence of these species. So the idea here was that the species are so low to begin with and encountered so infrequently in the fishery that if somebody does take one home, it's so infrequent that it's going to have almost no effect, almost to the point of having a closed fishery or no harvest.
Okay, thanks,
So it would require some documentation that there was either extremely low abundance or an extremely minimal fishery.
Yes, so the justification, if you're applying for an AMP, justification would be required, and you'd also have to have some sort of system to look for a signal that the fishery was increasing or abundance was increasing, and then go from there once you're starting to see fish, if you see them more frequently.
If I could
Okay,
follow up,
thank
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
I just wanted to let everyone know that there are 3 alternative management plans that were approved by the board already for recreational fisheries, and the technical committee was kind of following their process with approving those in developing these recommendations for this technical guidance document. So if you're interested in looking at those, there are on our website for South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida already AMPs in place for recreational harvest.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. So I think at this point, we do need to take some board action on this item. And Caitlin, am I correct in assuming that what we're looking for here is a motion from the board to approve this technical guidance document?
Yes, I think we would need a motion to approve it.
You have John Clark with his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you're ready, I have a motion.
Go ahead.
Move to approve the technical guidance document for implementation of amendments 2 and 3 to the Shad River Herring Fishery Management Plan.
Okay, thank you, John. Do we have a second to the motion?
Malcolm Rhodes, Dr. Malcolm Rhodes.
Thank you, Dr. Rhodes. Any discussion on the motion?
I don't know if John he still has his hand up. I don't know if he wants to speak to it. He put his hand down.
John, did you want to speak to the motion?
Sorry about that. I just put my hand down. I think the motion is self-explanatory. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask again if there's any discussion on the motion.
I don't have any hands raised, Justin.
Okay, given that, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion.
I see no hands raised.
Okay, so given that, we'll consider the motion approved by unanimous consent. All right, and moving on, we'll move on to our second item under review of technical committee progress, which would be an update on methods to evaluate bycatch and mixed stock fisheries. So Brian, go ahead.
Okay, as Mr. Chair said, we'll be going over the TC's progress on evaluating bycatch and mixed stock fisheries in state waters. Next slide. So a bit of background. Back in August of 2020, after receiving the results of the stock assessment, the board tasked the TC with identifying potential paths forward to improve shad stocks along the coast. Some system-specific recommendations were made at the last board meeting in February, and the TC identified the need to better understand and possibly reduce impacts to external stocks of directed mixed stock fisheries. Example that's often used is Hudson and Connecticut River shad being caught in the lower Delaware Bay. At that February meeting, the TC was tasked with developing methods to evaluate bycatch removals in directed mixed stock fisheries in state waters in order to understand and reduce impacts to these stocks. So we can go next slide. So far, we've developed a roadmap for going forward to accomplish this task, as you see here. First, we are going to define our goals and expectations, identify where these mixed stock fisheries are being executed, and collect any and all data available from these areas. This includes past and present DNA studies, tagging data, and commercial and recreational harvest data to determine where these mixed stock fisheries occur and to what degree. Once we know what data we have available, we can determine the feasibility of developing modeling methods to estimate composition of mixed stock fisheries. After that, we can evaluate any new or existing methods of reducing or eliminating mixed stock harvest. And finally, the goal here is to develop recommendations from the board on reducing or eliminating mixed stock harvest, or recommend research priorities going forward to address this task. Next slide. So here's where we are as of right now. The TC task group has been populated, which sent out a data request and data template to all state representatives looking for information on mixed stock fisheries and or bycatch. States with mixed stock fisheries have filled out the template with their available data and submitted them to the task group. And the task group will be meeting later this month for the first time to start evaluating the available data and plan how to move forward on this task. So that's generally where we are currently in regards to this task. Like I said, the TC task group will be meeting for the first time later this month, and I can take any questions that the board may have.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'll ask if anyone from the board has questions for Brian on this item.
I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Brian, I guess that means you can go ahead and move on to our last item under review of technical committee progress, considering the technical committee recommendations on addressing fish passage performance.
All righty, recommendations on addressing fish passage. We can go right to the next slide. Starting with a little background, this ties into the original board task of identifying potential paths forward to improve shad stocks. The TC indicated that further action is needed to improve fish passage due to passage mortality, posing a significant threat to stock recovery. Analysis done in the recent stock assessments suggests passage barriers reduce coastwide spawner production potential by up to 41%. As a result, the TC prepared a memo with recommendations for board action related to passage. So you can go next slide. Here we have some key information highlighted in the memo. The cumulative effect of barriers should be recognized as one of the most impactful obstacles to the recovery of American shad, in part due to a bunch of issues, including migratory delays, injuries and stress, and mortality to upstream and downstream migrants at adult and juvenile life stages. Assessment modeling of current passage efficiencies showed a less than 10% increase in spawner potential versus no passage at all at a first encountered barrier. Quantitative fish passage performance criteria are needed to test the effectiveness of fish passage facilities to achieve management goals. Fish passage prescription authority lies with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMFs under the Federal Power Act, as well as states often having the ability to address fish passage when issuing water quality certificates for operation. So next slide. So in regards to TC recommendations, the TC feels that the following actions are needed to reduce impacts of barriers and provide for population recovery. First and foremost, barrier removal is the preferred approach to restore habitat access. Obviously, this is not an option all the time or in every instance. So when dam removal is not an option, the development and use of fish passage performance standards in river systems based on available data, fish passage modeling tools, and fish passage expertise is recommended. If the required information to develop performance standards is not available, it should be developed. The TC recommends that the Commission forward letters to agencies with relative authorities to request prioritizations of these here mentioned issues when considering licensing and permitting of projects that might impede access to spawning grounds and outmigration. So next slide. So next steps for today. We already addressed the draft technical guidance document, so I can take any questions on the fish passage letter. Otherwise, we could hand it over to the board to consider.
Great, thanks, Brian. Before I potentially entertain questions related to this last part of the presentation, I wanted to invite the board members representing the federal agencies in question here to potentially provide comment on their sort of perceived value of sending letters to their respective agencies requesting prioritization according to the TC recommendations. So I'll just sort of put that out there. Max or Mike, if either of you would like to comment on this idea of sending letters.
Mike Millard.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I guess I'd like to say that the intent of that recommendation is certainly good. The service agrees that fish passage is a huge issue and probably the single largest action we can take to restore a system is removal of a dam, and then followed by passage mechanics after that. I guess I would say, speaking internally for the service in my region and probably the Southeast region, that a letter such as this may not move the needle too much. We feel like we already prioritize fish passage. We have, at least in the Northeast, we have full-time fish passage engineers that are real busy. We have a fish passage discretionary pot of money every year that we move out to our partners, including states and NGOs. In the Northeast, it's about just under $1.5 million a year, and I assume it's similar in our Southeast region. So could we do more? Sure, but that would come at the cost of other issues that are priorities, and I know that everyone on the board understands how that works. So having said that, though, such a letter could be useful when we get into Ferc negotiations, right? Everything you prescribe in a Ferc settlement needs to be justified pretty tightly. So a letter like this and the results that it might produce could be useful in those FERC negotiations for justifying prescriptive actions to the utilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Max?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so following on what Mike just said, I think for the agency, we would echo a lot of those sentiments. That very important work, and I don't think we would disagree with a lot of those bullet points on the previous slide. And we do prioritize this work, and I think there's a lot of great examples in the Northeast and successes in the past, and ongoing work here with other systems. We also require, testing and minor modifications to fishways during the life of FERC licenses, but of course, major changes are really only feasible during relicensing or when the license is first issued. So we do prioritize that work. We exercise our authorities under the Federal Power Act, and in regard to FERC relicensing, we reserve those authorities. But that's not to say that a letter of support, like Mike was saying, wouldn't be valuable. I think having the management authority's perspective, in this case, the commission's voice on why this work is needed to achieve certain management goals or objectives, could help, ground truth, as Mike was getting at. Some of our requests and proposals for fishways could definitely help tie that in with the commission's perspective. That could be helpful. And I think as part of that, it might be useful to have the technical committee help identify those systems that are high priority for shad recovery, and maybe inventory available data at those sites or other sites that could support the development of this fish passage criteria. I think that might help provide some guidance or direction to not just the federal agencies, but also the states, where to focus conservation efforts in the future. So I'll end there and see what other board members have to say on this.
Okay, thank you, Max and Mike, for those comments. I think those are very helpful and to the board's deliberations and how to move forward with this item. I'll ask if there are any other questions and comments from the board on this topic.
The only name I have is Allison Colden.
Okay, go ahead, Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This kind of follows along with the question or comment that Max just made. I was curious if there's already available or could be developed basically a list or a timeline of existing facilities that will be up for relicensing. It seems like, this is relicensing, or the point of licensing is one of the very few opportunities that states have to enforce or implement these performance standards. And I think it would be helpful if we knew when those facilities were up for relicensing to plan ahead to prioritize the development of those performance metrics. So I was wondering if that was currently available or could be developed relatively easily.
Thanks, Allison. Brian, I'm going to defer to you on that one, although we can also ask for input from Max or Mike if needed.
Sure. So Ken Sprankle with the Fish and Wildlife Service as I guess over the past couple of years been spearheading an effort to put together a database of different impoundments on a system by system or state by state basis, just to kind of get full coverage of the Atlantic coast and where we have impoundments, and possibly using that to prioritize where efforts at removing them will have the most effect. I don't think we have a list of terms of Ferc renewals coming up, but I'm sure that's something that could be put together.
Mr. Chair, you have Mike Millard.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can speak for the service, and I'll let Max, I guess, weigh in for NOAA, but we have full-time Ferc coordinators on staff that I assume have a list like that, or could easily get a list like that of Ferc relicensing schedules coming up. I guess I would add, while I have the floor, to Max's recommendation, I hate to dump more back on the TC, but it is one thing, it's a good thing to have a schedule of Ferc relicensings coming up. It would be value added to have that schedule with some sort of priority of the bang for the buck or the cost benefit of those events, Ferc events coming up in terms of fish passage and benefit to the fishery resources. Every negotiation, I think the service has to sort of weigh the cost benefit of how much to invest in that particular negotiation, and knowing that for fishery resources would help us inform those decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And Tony, was there another hand up after Mike?
Those were all the hands that I have so far.
Okay, great, thanks. So my takeaway from the discussion here is what we've heard from our federal partners is that there would be some value to sending the letters that the technical committee is recommending, particularly when it comes to the Ferc relicensing process. And Max Appelman also suggested that there might be some value as part of that correspondence in providing information to the agencies on prioritization of different projects that also might be helpful during the Ferc relicensing process for these agencies to make sort of cost-benefit decisions. So at this point, we can take action on this item, and Caitlin, I think we would be looking for a motion from the board relative to potentially sending these letters, correct?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, it's up to the board how they'd like to proceed. So I guess if the board would like to send a letter, we would need a motion to recommend that to the ISFMP policy board. But I guess I wanted to clarify process-wise for the technical committee. Is it preferable to have the technical committee try to gather this information and look at the list of Ferc relicenses and prioritize those, and then include that information in a letter that would go to the agencies? Or is it preferable to I guess send a letter today with less information and then follow up with that prioritization? I guess that's what I would like to clarify.
Brian, do you want to provide some input on that?
Sure. I think anytime you have more data you could put into the letter, it'd be more convincing. I think Caitlin brings up a pretty good point here. That might be worth going down that avenue. I guess just I'd be remiss to not get some guidance on the board. We also have the other task of the mixed stock fisheries. So I guess we look to the board for some guidance on prioritization on the tasks as well.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Mr. Chair, you have 2 board members and a member of the public. Your board members are Allison Colden and Megan Ware, and just let me know if you want to go to the public.
Okay, Megan, go ahead, and then I'll go to you, Allison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of just listening to this, a question I had for the TC. Where I feel like we're starting to talk maybe about like river specific data or recommendations. So I'm wondering, was the original intent of the letter to be, I don't want to say generic, but kind of like a single letter that everyone gets, or was the thought process that this would be a letter formulated for kind of each agency or state with specific information in it?
So I think the original intent here was to kind of send this out to the appropriate agencies as one letter. If we go the avenue of looking at prioritizations and system specific evaluations, it's certainly going to delay the sending of this letter, I'm sure, by quite a bit. So I think that's something to consider as well.
Okay, thanks. Allison?
I had my hand raised previously, just being willing to offer a motion to this regard, but happy to hold that until we figure out this issue of general versus specific letter.
Okay, thanks. And Tony, you mentioned there was someone from the public who had their hand up?
Yeah, Wilson Laney.
Okay, Wilson, go ahead. I will ask you to try to keep it brief because we are running up against the end of our allotted time on the agenda.
I will keep it brief, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for recognizing me. To the question about whether or not there is a list of upcoming Ferc licenses, the answer is yes. It's on the Ferc website. All you have to do is download it. And then with regard to prioritization of passage of barriers within individual states, some while back, and Caitlin should be able to find this information, Jeff Kipp was the staff person who was coordinating the ASMFC Fish Passage Working Group. And that was one thing the work group did, was we worked with the technical committee and the state representatives on the Fish Passage Working Group to put together a list of barrier priorities within each jurisdiction. It probably is somewhat dated now, since I think we did that quite a few years ago, but the technical committee would not have to start from scratch, is the point, if you all wanted to charge them with taking a look at both the FERC list and that previous list put together by the Fish Passage Work Group in considering whether or not to include that information in any letter that you might send to the Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS, and FERC. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for that comment, Wilson. Any other hands up at this point, Tony?
Just Allison has her hand up, and I don't know if that's a factor from before. There, she put it down, so it's not. No, I don't have any other hands.
Okay, well, at this point, I think it's probably time for us to potentially make a motion to take action. And Allison, I'll turn back to you since you mentioned that you were potentially ready to make a motion. Would you like to do so?
Sure. I don't know if staff has one ready, but I can try and do this on the fly as well, if not.
Allison, were you making a motion to send a letter or to task the TC?
I was going to go ahead and make the motion to send a letter to the agencies.
Okay, Maya, can you pull that motion up, please, that I drafted? It's the third one.
Okay. Move to recommend to the ISFMP Policy Board that the Commission write a letter to NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to prioritize the following actions to provide increased opportunities for population recovery of American shad. First, dam and barrier removals as the preferred approach to restore fish species habitat access for population restoration and for habitat restoration benefits. When dam removal is not an option, the development and use of fish passage performance standards in river systems based on available data, fish passage modeling tools, and fish passage expertise is recommended. If the required information to develop performance standards are not available, support their development for such purposes and applications.
Thank you, Allison. Do we have a second to the motion?
Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Cherie. Any discussion on the motion?
Max Appelman.
Okay, go ahead, Max.
Max, we can't hear you.
Be helpful to click the right button. Thank you. So, of course, given the intent of this motion, I would be abstaining, but I just wanted to comment on sort of the tone of what this looks like right now. And I think what Mike and I were saying earlier is that we already do prioritize this work. And so if the intent here is to request prioritization, I don't think that's going to do much. But again, if the tone were more in a supportive nature, I think that is something that we could take to the table at these Ferc negotiations. So just making that sort of comment on what the tone of this letter, how this letter could help the agencies.
Thank you, Max. Any other discussion on the motion?
I don't see any other hands raised, Justin.
Okay, process question, Tony. I can ask if there's any objections, and if there aren't any, should I also ask if there are any abstentions, given that we've had one board member indicating they're going to abstain from the vote?
Yeah, you can do it that way. Just ask if there's objections, and then we'll indicate one abstention, unless Mike also abstains. And he has his hand up as an abstention, so you could do those too. Allison Colden does have her hand up now.
Allison, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to Max, I was wondering if slightly modifying this language would help, and I would suggest move to recommend to the ISFMP Policy Board that the Commission write a letter to NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supporting their activities in dam passage review to provide increased opportunities, et cetera. I would love some feedback and would be willing, if the seconder was comfortable with that, to make that adjustment.
Okay, thanks, Allison. I guess I'll first ask Max to respond if you view this as an improvement to the motion.
Sure, yeah, I do. I think Allison's on the right track here. You know, maybe just finding a way to cut out prioritize and substitute with support actions. Maybe that is a clean way to do it.
Okay, thanks, Max. Allison, would you be good with that wording?
Yes, that's fine with me. Thank you.
And Shri, I'll also ask you as the seconder of the motion if you're good with that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other discussion on the motion?
You have no hands raised.
Okay, given that, I'll ask if there are any objections to this motion.
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure the motion is in a final language.
Yeah, I was just going to
okay.
say, I think Max wanted to remove prioritize. So maybe it should say supporting their activities in dam passage review to provide increased opportunities. Is that what you said, Allison?
Yes, I think that's correct.
if I could just jump in again, Mr. Chair, and just say, as long as we're clear on the record of when staff actually goes and writes this letter, and that it takes a tone, a supporting tone as opposed to a directive, I think I'm fine with this. Of course, I am abstaining. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Max. And thank you, everybody, for keeping me honest there and noting that the motion wasn't in final form yet. Now that I believe we've got it in final form, I'll ask again if there are any objections, noting that there are already 2 abstentions on the record from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service.
I see no hands raised in objection.
Great, thanks. We'll consider this approved by consent. I think the other matter we have to deal with here is there was some discussion about potential value in tasking the technical committee with coming up with prioritizations of different barriers for restoration action, potentially using the list of upcoming Ferc actions as a guiding tool for that. Also keeping in mind, though, that the technical committee already currently has one task on their docket ongoing, the update on, the evaluation of bycatch and mixed stock fisheries. So I guess I'll put this back to the board. Would anyone care to make a motion to task the technical committee with an additional task related to prioritization of fish passage projects, keeping in mind that we should then also give some guidance on prioritization of the technical committee's tasking?
Max Appelman.
Go ahead, Max.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm happy to make that motion. I think this is a valuable exercise, and hearing from Wilson, you don't really need to start from scratch. There might be some documents there to get it started. So I do have a motion. I don't know if staff wants to. Yeah, great. So I would move to task the technical committee with prioritizing systems for shad recovery and developing an inventory of available data that would support development of fish passage criteria. And the intent here, given the workload already on the TC, would be to prioritize this below those ongoing TC tasks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Max. Do we have a second to the motion?
Mike Millard.
Thanks, Mike. Any discussion on the motion?
Mike Millard.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I obviously support the motion since I seconded it, but I guess I would add that there are, in addition to what Wilson identified, I know there's more than a couple map-based prioritization tools for at some sort of Huck 8 level, I think, or maybe even finer than that, for prioritizing where you get the biggest bang for the buck for fish passage, given the fisheries resources in the basin. So there are tools available for the TC to draw upon. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Any other discussion on the motion?
No additional hands, Mr. Chair.
Okay, given that, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion.
I see no hands.
Okay, we'll consider the motion approved by unanimous consent. Thanks, everybody. All right, and we'll now move on to the last item on our agenda. I apologize, we have run a bit over our allotted time here, so we'll attempt to move through this last item quickly, which is to consider approval of the Shad Habitat Plan updates. Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to move quickly. I don't want to cut into people's lunches too much. So we have some shad habitat plan updates for you. We can go to the next slide. So just a bit of background. Under Amendment 3, all states and jurisdictions are required to submit habitat plans for American shad, which are meant to contain a summary of information, current and historical spawning and nursery habitats, threats to those habitats, and any restoration programs that the states are undertaking. In February, the board agreed that these plans should be updated every 5 years or so, similar to SFMPs, and asked that states update existing plans originally approved in 2014, and for the states with missing plans to submit new habitat plans. This is the Merrimack and the Hudson. 6 habitat plans were approved by the board back in February. Go to the next slide. Today we have another 6 habitat plans for board consideration. The TC has reviewed all of these plans and recommends them all for board approval. Next slide. Here's our habitat update plan updates. You can go to the next slide. For the Massachusetts coastal rivers, new sections were incorporated in regards to shad runs in the Jones, North, South, and Nepisonnet rivers. So we have a whole bunch. They did a whole bunch of updates, new summaries on their table 1, looking at the different shad runs in the state. So generally, just a general update. Nothing too crazy. You can go to the next slide. Rhode Island updated its habitat plan with recent dam removals and fishway installations and improvements on the Pawtucket and Pawtuxet rivers. Next slide. Connecticut updated many of its tables and figures, and as well as maps in the habitat plan. Updated threats to the assessment section, the threats assessment section, updated the habitat assessment, as well as the habitat restoration sections with any new info from the previous plan that's come up since the previous plan. Next slide. So the Delaware River Basin states updated their plan. This is obviously New York, New Jersey, PA, and Delaware. More information on salt front location and primary historical spawning grounds in the background section. They also updated main stem and tributary habitat assessment, updated the nursery habitat section, as well as the threat assessment section. Go next slide. For South Carolina, there was acknowledgement of the approved joint shad habitat plan for the Savannah River between South Carolina and Georgia. They updated information regarding the Yadkin PD River Ferc relicensing to issue to Duke Energy, some river-specific online tools available to the public that include information for a whole bunch of different issues in regards to licensing in specific rivers and information regarding the Santee Cooper Ferc license, which has not yet been issued. They also added some additional fish passage consideration. Next slide. And finally, Florida updated sections on the St. Johns, the Wakachi River, and the Ocklawaha. I think I might have added an extra A in there somewhere. Specifically updated the Basin Management Action Plan for Lake Jessup, which discharges into the historical spawning grounds for shad, as well as the basin management plans for the first 3 springs that discharge into the St. Johns River. Updated as I said, the Econo-Wakahatchee plan and the Ocklawaha. The St. Johns River Management District updated its review of impacts, removing the dam on nutrient dynamics downstream. So we can go to the next slide. Today, the board needs to consider approval of the 6 plans presented. The TC recommends that all 6 plans that I just went through there should be approved by the board. Also, a possible recommendation that the remaining states update habitat plans and submit new plans in the case of the Hudson and the Merrimack in time for the TC to review for the next board meeting. So I could take any questions if anybody has it. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. I admire your courage in attempting some of those river names. There were some doozies in there.
Thank you.
So I'll ask if anyone on the board has questions for Brian.
I do not see any hands, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Given that, I'll ask if anyone on the board would care to make a motion. Oh, sorry.
Mike Armstrong just put his hand up. I apologize.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, I was anticipating your next words, as in, I assume they were asking for a motion. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
That is correct, Mike.
All right, I have one for you. Move to approve the Shad Habitat Plan updates for Mass, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware River, South Carolina, and Florida as presented today.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Do we have a second to the motion?
I saw Lynn Figley's hand first.
Okay, Lynn, thank you. Any discussion from the board? I will make one note. There was a recommendation in there from the technical committee that states with plans still outstanding, submit those in time for review before the next board meeting. And I guess I would ask the maker of the motion if you would be amenable to adding something in here to the motion to address that recommendation.
This is staff, Caitlin. I don't think it's necessary, but if you would like to include it in the motion, that's fine.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Given that, maybe it's not necessary.
I don't see any hands wanting to comment on the motion, Mr. Chair.
Okay, given that, I'll ask if there are any objections to the motion.
I see no hands raised.
Okay, we'll consider the motion approved by unanimous consent. Thanks, everyone. So moving on to our last item on the agenda, is there any other business to come before this board today?
I don't see any hands raised.
All right, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, thank you.